How can we understand leadership when we can hardly understand people? This is a crash course series, so I'm going to be covering 40 to 50 textbook pages of material in about 10 to 15 minutes. So it's really important that you know that I'm not covering everything in detail as it is in the book, so you still need to read the book. However, I am going to give you a snapshot of all of it, so hopefully when you go to take your next test, you'll have a better understanding of everything that it's required of you, and you'll be more interested in the material when you go back and read the textbook. This chapter is titled The Human Element. The question is, how can we understand leadership when we hardly understand people? The great variable in this equation of leadership is the human element. Humankind has set foot upon the moon, explored Mars, probed the solar system and beyond, and yet nothing is so puzzling as what we immediately see before us, the human mind. What is personality? Leaders try to understand personality so that they might better understand people. And it's important to ask the questions of what factors shape personality and how can we better describe personality. Nature versus nurture is the first thing we get to talk about. Nature versus nurture asks whether it is inborn qualities or personal experiences that shape who we are. The first example is the identical twins example. So identical twins have identical genes, and indeed they are so alike that researchers have found that if raised separately, each twin is apt to grow up to become much like the other. And it seems like nature might be in control, but over here we also have nurture. The nurture example is with a dog. So what makes dogs be able to sit, stay, and fetch on command? Training does. Nurturing can produce powerful effects, and training is what brings people to be able to be nurtured and learn different things. So for leaders, we have to recognize that we can affect that environment. As leaders, we can affect the environment that teaches people different things and affects the nurture kind of nature versus nurture. Another theory we get to talk about is birth order theory. So some people contend that the rank within one's family can have effect on their personality and intelligence. On the right, you can see that 8 of the 10 presidents, past 10 presidents, can be considered firstborn children. And advocates of birth order theory claim that firstborns have an edge in developing leadership skills. Whether or not this is entirely true, the arguments for and against it can be used to help leaders understand different people's circumstances and place in their family. So it's a good way to start thinking about how a person's environment can shape their personality. What is charisma? Charisma is so important to leadership to understand the positive and benefits and the negatives of it. So charisma is the sparkle in people that money can't buy. It is basically invisible energy with visible effects. It can help to win hearts and minds, meaning that if somebody has charisma, if you see a leader that has a lot of charisma, you might want to follow them easier, you might admire them more. However, it can also be a perilous shortcut, so you can overlook some valuable qualities of leadership if someone has charisma. So it might be a complete cloak of invisibility to everything else the leader is if they have charisma. The other question is charisma the X factor? Is it like the magic potion that turns mere mortals into leaders? Definitely not. One expert said it best, charisma is the result of effective leadership, not the other way around. The Johari Window is a way to explore our self-perception. So Johari Window has 4 different arenas, as you can see on the right: the public arena, the blind arena, the private arena, and the unknown area. An example of this too is called the adjectives game. So trying to write down a bunch of adjectives about who you are, like if you're athletic, if you're honest, if you're brave, and then ask your friends to do the exact same thing, or your family to do the exact same thing, and it might open your mind a little bit to the type of person that other people see you to be. It's also really important to keep in mind to not be super uber critical about yourself in this way. It can help you be very insightful to see if there's something that you want to change, but ultimately people's opinion needs to be taken at face value, and you are the person that should change who you are because you want to change it. Personality might be a vague and squishy and kind of difficult to understand topic, so the MBTI is actually a really awesome way to talk about it intelligently. A lot of people have problems with the MBTI, which is the Myers-Briggs type indicator, because it offers different labels for personality when it is really difficult to label personality. So the MBTI merely attempts to describe our different flavors of personality. It doesn't have all of them, and it's not a catch-all phrase for what personality is, but it is a way to talk about it intelligently. So here are the examples of the MBTI. You can either be extroverted or introverted, intuitive or sensing, thinking or feeling, and judging or perceiving. And I gave some parentheses that you can pause the video and look at now if you like. If you haven't taken an MBTI already, you can find it online, and they are very insightful to help you try and understand what kind of personality you have. And the most important implication for leaders here is that if you look into the MBTI and you maybe see some qualities about people, it might help you be more empathetic to try and lead them in a certain way. But again, it's not a catch-all, and it's not a formula. It's not formulaic for how to lead. Maslow's hierarchy of needs claims that people are motivated by unfulfilled needs. The biggest part about this is that unless physiological needs are met, you can't achieve a different ring. So if you can look here, if you don't meet the basic physiological safety needs of your people, you can't go any further up the chain. So the different levels here are physiological needs, safety needs, love or belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. So if you haven't let your team of people go to the bathroom in 48 hours, they aren't going to be able to focus on any kind of self-actualization or training or anything else, because they're not going to be safe. Their physiological needs aren't met, and ultimately those are really important for trying to train a group of people. Hawthorne studies are trying to explain that when leaders pay attention to their people and treat them as partners, people feel more appreciated and will perform better. So the study is that people went into a factory setting business, and they changed a bunch of light bulbs, they changed a bunch of small things to try and see if their people perform better, but ultimately what ended up happening was they did perform better, but only because their leaders were paying attention to them, asking them questions, and involving them in this experiment. So this helps to discover human beings in the workplace, and the fact that when we feel like we're appreciated, people tend to work better. Pavlov's dogs explains we're going to explain cat. Now we're going to explain classical conditioning and Pavlov's dogs. Pavlov's dogs claims that a stimulus can trigger a reflex. This was an experiment that basically explains the carrot and the stick analogy. So with a dog example, Ian Pavlov studied the digestive system in dogs, and he learned that dogs produce saliva to help them chew and swallow their food. So his breakthrough came when he noticed his dogs drooling even though there wasn't any food around, and he discovered the dogs were reacting to his lab coat. So whenever Pavlov had fed his dogs, he was always wearing a white lab coat. Therefore, the dogs saw the lab coat and they assumed that it was time for supper, and they started to drool. So this claimed that the stimulus, his white lab coat, can trigger a reflex. In the same way that positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement can trigger a reflex in your followers. The negative things to this is it is kind of a carrot and the stick analogy. So two things that can happen: a leader can run out of carrots. There might not be anything to trigger a reflex anymore, and they have to work on their own, but they can't because they've become reliant on a carrot. And secondly, the followers might lose their appetite in metaphors. So if you don't have anything to have the carrot and the stick analogy work, then the follower might not be able to follow because they don't have an intrinsic reward, it's only extrinsic. The Milgram Experiment was a way to discover that obedience to authority was a powerful motivator. So as you can see on the diagram to the right, the experiment was trying to test how much pain an ordinary person can inflict on one another simply because they are told to do so. So basically if you can imagine, you and another volunteer, a complete stranger, enter a laboratory at a prestigious university. You're seated before a control panel with dials and switches, and the other volunteer takes a seat in the nearby room. Wires are connected to his body, but then a curtain is drawn. You'll be able to hear this other volunteer, but you can't see him anymore, and your host, the researcher, as you can see in the top diagram, is wearing a white lab coat and explains he wants to conduct an experiment involving a study of memory and punishment. So throughout this experiment, the researcher tells you to hit certain buttons, and you hear screams of agony, and it's quite obvious that you're inflicting pain upon this other person. The experiment is to see how much authority this person has having on you, and if you actually go all the way up to the highest chains of what you think is inflicting pain because you are told to do so. In reality, no one was really hurt and it was all acting. Researcher Stanley Milgram found that 63% of men who acted as teachers were willing to carry this diabolical experiment to the end and turn the dial all the way up to the largest form of punishment. So that is a crazy thing, and it also explains that as leaders, if we have an influence over people, we have a responsibility to carry it responsibly. I liked this quote, as you can see right here: conflict is inevitable, but combat is optional. So interpersonal conflict in teams and as a leader, there will be conflict, but in the way that we handle conflict is one of the most important things. So in having the highest court of the land, this is the Supreme Court with the Civic Leadership Academy, and they handle the biggest forms of conflict. It's important to understand certain defense mechanisms when we're leading other people because they are prevalent. So the book lists a bunch of different ones that you can see here. Defense mechanisms on the right, as you can say, are displacement, projection, rationalization, intellectualization, denial, suppression, and withdrawal. Those are things you can read about in the book, but some things that I wanted to note is that defense mechanisms are completely normal. They protect us from physiological injury. However, they can be a problem and they can be habit forming. So even though these are unconscious motivators, again, things like displacement or projection, you might project onto other people, and that becomes habit forming, that becomes part of your personality, and that's definitely not a good thing. Even though it's unconscious, the human mind is like an iceberg, and you can see that example on the right. We're aware of many of our own thoughts, and we're conscious of the tip of the iceberg, but there's much more invisibly lurking under the surface of our mind, and that's why we call our defense mechanisms unconscious, because there's a lot more at stake if you don't try and dive into your defense mechanisms and make sure that you know where they're coming from. Conflict is a disagreement through which individuals perceive a threat to their needs, interests, or concerns. For the leader, it's important to note that conflict can be very difficult at times, but it's important to handle it responsibly. Knee-jerk reactions such as acting out or lashing out are not acceptable, and using deliberate actions are much more important. But conflict is certain going through the ranks. I mean, the rank structure in itself presents conflict, as you can see in the right. It says if three friends join CAP together, earning airmen at the same time, the progress and change, eventually they'll all be in the point where they can achieve a certain promotion or a certain position in the squadron, and if there's only one there, there's going to be some conflict. But when cadets choose to keep supporting one another or let the other conflict side over instead of destroying their friendship, ultimately that's a lot better way to solve conflict. This case study was from the U.S. Air Force Academy, where women at the academy had reported 150 sexual assaults over 10 years, and what the Pentagon Inspector General found most troubling was that the commanders took little action when the accusations were private, but they took action when they became public. And they had all their cadets take an oath to protect against sexual assault, even though they failed to change the culture until the problem made national news. So that's the leader's duty, to manage conflict. Even if it's become a huge thing and it's hard to manage, the leader has a responsibility to manage that conflict. Diversity is so important in leading in today's age, regardless of what kind of misconceptions or perceptions other people might have. Diversity is prevalent in our society, and it will continue to be so. So leading in a diverse society, the armed forces were one of the first American institutions to racially desegregate. There's a picture of the Tuskegee Airmen at the bottom. CAP was founded on a commitment to this diversity, and each of you have a responsibility to honor it and honor the people around you, regardless of their race, regardless of their gender, regardless of the type of personality quirks or aspects that they have. And every perspective, as a leader, you should recognize that every perspective has a value, whether you see it firsthand or not. So regardless of their background, even if you haven't lived in that background, it's important to note that every perspective is valued, and it has a different way of looking at a situation that might actually help you in the long run if you were to be respectful of it. The definition of prejudice is basically to prejudge, and the biggest thing to note here, guys, is that leaders are expected to create a welcoming atmosphere, especially because it is a volunteer organization. And there's a picture at the bottom of how we are going to continue to live in a more diverse society. It's showing the racial changes throughout the next few years in America. And it's important to note that regardless of color, regardless of gender, regardless of all those labels, everybody has a certain perspective that can bring value to the team. And that's what we do, because if we're looking to promote mission effectiveness, everybody has a different perspective that should help mission effectiveness, and focusing on prejudice ultimately brings negative things to the team, and it pushes people down when a different perspective should be welcome and included. And there are ways to make sure that you and your team members do this. The book provides 5 different ways to fight hate, and that is to rise up, pull together, speak out, support the victims, and teach tolerance. Tolerance is really important, because even if you have a different perspective, even if you grew up a different way, to be tolerant of other perspectives and welcome their ideas into a team environment is really important. If there is a silver lining to prejudice and bigotry, it's that tough times give leaders an opportunity to teach this tolerance. School and CAP cadet programs are important places where young people can learn from their own and another's mistakes, and leaders ought not miss the opportunity to eradicate ignorance in this perspective. The human element is really important to note as a leader, and the more you dive into these topics throughout this time, the more you can become a more effective, more welcoming, and more inclusive leader.